Welcome to everyone joining us today online for the Animals in Society Research Initiative Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Manisha Deka, and I'm the Academic Director of the Animals in Society Research Initiative here at the University of Victoria. Our interdisciplinary unit is based in the Faculty of Law, where I also hold the Lansdowne Chair in Law. Here at the University of Victoria, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Wasanish peoples and Songhees peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. In alignment with many Indigenous and anti-colonial worldviews and scholarly writings, we recall the animals and non-human species who are indigenous to this territory and whose fates have been fundamentally affected by the settler colonialism that exists in what we now call Canada. And we know that this phenomenon and the racism and sexism on which it is premised are foundationally shaped by concepts of animality, anthropocentrism, and the devaluation of animalized humans along with non-humans themselves. The Animal Society Research Initiative is an interdisciplinary forum at the University of Victoria that takes up this type of critique of human social relations and tries to surface and visibilize the multiple forms and systems of violence and marginalization to promote greater visibility of what happens to animals and how their lives are entangled with humans. If you'd like more information on our work, please do visit our website, and our wonderful coordinator, Holly, is posting the link on the chat now for you, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to receive our monthly newsletter online and stay up to date on news and events in animal law and animal studies. Today, we are very pleased to be welcoming a wide range of participants from several countries. Thank you all for joining from various time zones. And we're thrilled to welcome Associate Professor Sophie Esch from Rice University in Houston, presenting under the title War as a Multi-Species Contact Zone, Perspectives from Africa and Latin America. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Esch with us today. We know that this is a very timely discussion given the scale of human warfaring in our contemporary era, not the least of which is the warfare and genocide in Gaza and the precarious ceasefire that is top of mind for so many of us. Indeed, if we think of the devastation to Palestinian life, even focusing only on the violence and traumas that immensely vulnerable children in Gaza have suffered, the scale of human suffering alone seems completely overwhelming. At the same time, we know from many animal studies scholars that genocides, conflicts, and the whole concept of war directly and profoundly affect animals and turn on the concept of animal. We are really fortunate to have Dr. Esch with us with her new book monograph to take us through her thinking about this subject on multiple layers and through multiple ways in relation to literature and recent devastating conflicts in Mozambique and Colombia. Dr. Esch is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies at Rice University. Her research areas are in the intersection of literature, politics, and war in modern Latin America and Africa. She is also a faculty affiliate of Politics, Law, and Social Thought and at the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her first book, Modernity at Gunpoint, Firearms, Politics, and Culture in Mexico and Central America, received the 2019 Best Books in the Humanities Award of the Mexico section of LASA, the Latin American Studies Association. She's the editor of Central American Literature as World Literature and special issues on animal studies, Mexican literature, and Central American literature for Hispanic Review, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, and Human Animalia. Her current book project, Creaturely Cold War, More Than Human Narratives of War and Revolution in Latin America and Africa, uncovers a particular strand of global Cold War literature that relies heavily on non-human creatures and ecological entanglements to tell its stories, and thus challenges bipolar Manichean accounts of the period. The book, which we will be discussing today, excerpts of, provides a South-South comparison of prose fiction from Mozambique, Angola, Cuba, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Mexico. We will have time following her presentation for a Q&A period, so please do post your questions in the chat, and I will be able to order those and read them out. So now with a warm welcome, I'm delighted to turn the mic over to you, Dr. Esch.
Thank you so much, Manisha, for this introduction and for the invitation. Thank you and Holly for the organization. It's a true honor and privilege to be here and to be able to share the research with you all and with such an international group. I'm really excited about that. So maybe just as a starting point and out of curiosity, I'm going to invite everybody to just post quickly in the chat what discipline and if you want also what country you're joining us from, just to get sort of a sense, because I think that's one of the beauties of animal studies, that it is such an interdisciplinary field. So I'm also curious just in terms of what is the main discipline that you identify with. So if you could put that in the chat, that would be fantastic. And okay. Wonderful. Biology, comparative literature, anthropology, animal rights activists, military history. Fantastic. Veterinarian, East Asian literature, early childhood education. Wow. Really fascinating group. So I also really very much look forward to the discussion. Just to give you sort of a little bit of a context, as Manisha said, what I'm presenting today and what was shared with you sort of is part of a book project that is sort of in its final stages called Creaturely Cold War, which really looks at multi-species narratives of war and revolution in Latin America and in Luso-Africa, so in Portuguese-speaking Africa, with sort of the idea that there is an overlooked fauna-centric tradition in these literatures, and that really also in relation to kind of Cold War narratives, which tend to be these very bipolar narratives about East and West, left and right, etc., that there's another dimension, which I call the creaturely Cold War, where authors rely on multi-species and ecological narratives of war and revolution to kind of find a third way, a non-aligned way to think through those conflicts and the ideologies and the wars. That's broadly the book. What I prepared for today is sort of more, is not focused on the Cold War specifically, but more focused on the conceptual part that I thought could be of broader interest to people of thinking about war as a multi-species contact zone, and then giving some examples from the literature that I study. Let me start by saying that this talk risks stating the obvious. War is a multi-species affair. What we call human warfaring always involves, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, countless non-human creatures, organisms, and entities. Yet much of conventional war literature and scholarship usually treats war as if it were an exclusively human endeavor. As historian Frank Uketa observes, quote, "When it comes to war, the human element is usually front and center, and the environment appears as a side issue at best and a distraction at worst." But whereas humans may pull the triggers, war unfolds as a volatile, multi-species contact zone with far-reaching consequences across the web of life. Modern wars are never contained phenomena. They extend deep into civilian and more than human worlds. Insects, plants, and mammals both have an effect on warfare and are affected by it, sometimes in spectacular and dramatic fashion, sometimes in more subtle and indirect ways. This talk conceives of war as a multi-species contact zone to foreground the manifold, often fraught interspecies entanglements that emerge during armed conflict. It highlights how writers and artists from the global south insist that war is always a more than human event with profound implications for diverse life worlds. The discussion focuses in particular on examples from Mozambique and Colombia, two biodiversity hotspots marked by long histories of conflict in the 20th century. And this talk is divided in three parts. First, I'll give an overview over the literature. Then I'll focus on definitions and conceptual considerations, and then give some examples from Mozambique, and if we have time, in closing, from Colombia. To be clear, there exists a good deal of studies on the environmental history of wars, but they tend to have only a limited scope. Most focus, as you can see from the books on the slide, on classical questions of pollution, destruction, and terrain, and often they are primarily focused on the wars most visible in the Euro-Anglo-American imagination, so the two world wars, the American Civil War, and the US wars in Vietnam and the Gulf. Recently, there's a growing body of work on environmental warfare in Gaza and South Lebanon. But moreover, most historians tend to shy away from the more radical implications of the non-human term, namely the agency of non-human entities. Anthropologists, by contrast, especially those who adhere to the ontological term, feel comfortable embracing the notion of non-human agency fully. The long-term armed conflict in Colombia in particular has led to a slew of recent studies about the ecological implications and dimensions of armed conflict. One particularly compelling study, Daniel Ruiz Serna's When Forests Run Amok, War and Its Afterlives in Indigenous and Afro-Colombian Territories, shows the ecological implications of the conflict. In Colombia, indigenous and Afro-descendant conceptions of the territory as a living entity led to the unprecedented legal recognition of non-human entities as victims of the armed conflict. In 2011, the Territorio was recognized as a victim, and in 2023, the Cauca River. Informed by 15 years of fieldwork, Ruiz Serna portrays and analyzes several cases of how the conflict has disrupted the human-non-human assemblages in the Bajo Atrato region. Based on Afro-Indigenous cosmologies and ontologies, Ruiz Serna proposes a kind of epistemic shift regarding armed violence, one that accounts for the harm suffered by wider assemblages of human and other than human beings, but also for its world-making effects. He stresses that an ecological view of armed conflict does not simply mean including animals or the environment in our accounts of human destructive acts. To do so would only enact the nature-culture divide, but rather to describe how war reconfigures whole ecologies or relational worlds made of human and other than human entanglements. This, of course, does not mean that we should not heed attention to non-human animals in war, which often only appear in war studies in reductive ways. Luis Serna himself dedicates a chapter to jaguars in the conflict in Colombia and one to other creatures called fieras and encantos by the local population. Non-human animals often occupy the odd role of being highly visible. Think elephantries, cavalries, Picasso's Guernica, the cats in Ukraine and the donkeys in Palestine, and simultaneously overlooked in the context of human warfaring. Yet non-human animals suffer and die in war. They sustain battle in the form of labor, food, or consumer commodities. Only occasionally, though, do they make it into official accounts of war, and if so, it is generally domesticated species laboring at the behest of humans within a combat context, especially during World War I. Draft animals, pigeons carrying messages, cats in trenches. Studies either celebrate these animals in sentimental, tragic, and nationalist terms as unsung heroes, or bemoan the battlefield as an additional side of the exploitation of animals by humans. While these are important and noteworthy stories to tell, an estimated 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules died on World War I battlefields. They are far from telling a comprehensive study about the Earth's many species and their forced, accidental, and voluntary imbrications and what is known as human warfaring, both on and off the battlefield. There's the wildlife killed or affected by sound pollution in combat zones, or the mosquitoes that aided the cause of Haitian independence. Then there are the many instances of toxins produced for warfaring, unfolding an unprecedented constellation of both rapid and slow violence against ecosystems, non-human life forms, and human civilians and combatants alike. Among the studies toggling environmental history and animal history, the ones that I find particularly illuminating tend to be the ones on war and insects. One example is the biochemical weapons developed and employed during World War I, which led to the development of a chemical industry focused on insecticides and herbicides. While the use of biochemical weapons against humans in war was forbidden in 1925 in the 1925 Geneva Protocol, these weapons were then turned against insects in the name of pest control in agriculture in the 20th century, as explored in Edmund Russell's War and Nature, Fighting Humans and Insects with Chemicals from World War I to Silent Spring. And as Russell puts it, quote, war and control of nature co-evolved. The control of nature expanded the scale of war, and war expanded the scale on which people controlled nature. And there are also less direct but nonetheless noteworthy relations between animals, the environment, and war. For example, the British paid back their World War II debt to the US Americans via the expansion and fees from wildlife parks in Africa. Obviously, wildlife too is often negatively impacted by modern warfare, and increasingly so in the second half of the 20th century. For instance, over 80% of recent wars have taken place in so-called biodiversity hotspots, geographical areas particularly rich and endangered in their biodiversity. This designation also applies to many of the countries I study here. The post-independence war in Mozambique from 1977 to 1992 that I study is a notorious example of the detrimental effect of war on wildlife. The country's biggest wildlife reserve, Gorongosa National Park, lost 95% of its big mammal population during the conflict that ravaged the country in the 1980s. And Colombia, which has suffered different waves of armed conflict over decades, from La Violencia from 1948 to 1958, and the current conflict that started in 1964 and to a degree continues to this day despite peace agreements with the FARC in 2016, is one of the most mega diverse countries in the world, and big parts of the conflict have been fought in the countryside and negatively impacted the ecosystems and its human and non-human inhabitants. That being said, war does not only work to the detriment of humans. Rewilding of land and oceans due to armed conflict can lead to the recovery of ecosystems and animal species, and the Ukraine is a recent example of rewilding of certain areas. Non-humans are not only victims of war, but can also benefit from it. For example, all the animals who feed on carrion, those who are decomposers, or those that flourish when an apex predator species disappears from the ecosystem. One of the most well-known examples of non-human organisms benefiting from war is the poppies during World War I. In the areas of most intense and prolonged fighting, such as Verdun and Flanders Field, the ground was ripped, cratered, pitted, and charred by a million artillery shells, and holding layers of chemicals and human and animal bones. Poppies, as you might know, are plants that thrive in disturbed and in richly fertilized soil, and thus they started flowering in mass across the Western Front, setting the battlefields ablaze in red and becoming also an important symbol of remembrance because of that. This is just to give you an overview over the literature. In the second part, I will talk a little bit more about definitions of war and what do I mean when I talk about war. For example, animal activists might talk about the human war against animals in the context of the meat industry. And nature documentaries will use a lot of war metaphors, for example, to talk about animals per se. But what I'm referring here is really armed conflict led by humans, but there are also important distinctions and definitions. In my research, I operate with a broad definition of war, beyond interstate conflicts, beyond the combat zone, and beyond the human. Conventional definitions of war are not only anthropocentric, but usually focused only on the combat zone and international strife, meaning conflicts between nation states. That's sort of the classical definition by Clausewitz. A common narrow definition of war in political science is that of a sustained armed conflict among factions that leads to more than 1,000 battle-related fatalities. And that, of course, is always referred in reference to human fatalities. There is no definition that takes into account animal fatalities during war. And in my broader definition, informed by feminist war studies, I see war as an action that happens both on and beyond the battlefield, if such a battlefield is even clearly demarcated. Because in general, I do not subscribe to the patriarchal military division of the male combat war zone versus the domestic female civilian sphere, supposedly removed from the war. And neither do most militaries in modern wars. War is much the logistics apparatus that sustains the armed contention, often far removed from the battlefield, as it is the actual violence and employment of arms. As mentioned before, modern wars are never contained phenomena, but they reach far into human civilian, but also into more than human life worlds. Thus here I employ a broad and, in my view, more apt definition of war that includes a range of armed conflicts, so not just between nation states and violent confrontations among humans, leading to considerable loss and harm of life, and that extends far beyond the battlefield. Here then I propose to conceive of war as a multi-species contact zone, to make visible the forced, accidental, and voluntary imbrications of the Earth's many species in what is known as human warfaring. Reframing Mary-Louise Pratt's famous coinage of a cultural contact zone, which she developed on the basis of analyzing the conquest of the Americas. Here I frame war as a multi-species contact zone where different species, creatures, entities, organisms, quote, meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power. And this outside the quote, and me adding that in a context of extreme duress, precarity, and violence, which sharpens the moral and political contours and implications of these encounters for those who dare to pay attention to these non-human others that are present. And in general, I should point out that the idea of transferring here idea of a cultural contact zone, which was only focused on humans, to think about a multi-species contact zone, that's not my idea. There's several scholars that have done that over recent years, and Mary-Louise Pratt, in her recent book, Planetary Longings, she has one short chapter where she also reflects on sort of the afterlives of the concept and how multi-species contact zone becomes a concept. But what I'm proposing here is specifically to use that concept to think about war and combine it, thus war, with multi-species studies. And the emergent field of multi-species studies aims to better account for the entanglements that make up life on Earth and to develop, quote, practices of attentiveness to the complex ways that we, all of us, become inconsequential relationships with others. Channeling the multi-species studies penchant for what Anna Lovenhaupt-Singh calls, quote, the arts of noticing, my research draws to the fore texts and interpretations that pay close attention to non-human life forms and that place the human in contact and in active engagement with other species. The purpose is to trace manifold, often messy, uneasy, unsettling, and uneven interspecies interaction under the extreme conditions of armed conflict, positing that war creates often volatile and fraught spheres of unexpected encounter and proximity. And here again, literature is, of course, an interesting place to study this, because if you think about a lot of the war novels that you might also read in school that are obligatory texts, they tend to be very anthropocentric in nature. And thus, part of my research was also to look for authors and descriptions of war that approach it from a different perspective, and that really represent it as a multi-species contact zone. And a central place that I found for such a different approach was Mozambique, in part, of course, in relation to what I mentioned, that it is an example of the grave effects of armed conflict on biodiversity, but it also has to do, of course, with a certain gaze, a certain perspective that authors from the country bring to the war and how they narrate the war. And while just in terms of time, I won't spend much time explaining the war itself. I already mentioned the duration. It lasted 16 years. It was a war that came about after the country had just gained independence from Portugal, and involved two different groups in the context of Cold War conflicts, ethnic differences in the country, and severe international involvement and meddling. So there was also several countries involved in the war, among them South Africa, that had a vested interest in Frelimo, the governing organization, which was Marxist at that time, not remaining in power. And in what follows, I'm going to be talking about novels by two Mozambican authors. On the left, we have Mia Couto, who's the best-known author from Mozambique. And then on the right, from my perspective, you have Paulina Josiane, who is the best-known Black female author from Mozambique, and who was the first African woman to win the Camões Prize recently, one of the most important prizes in the Portuguese-speaking world. But I will talk first primarily about Mia Couto and his novel Sleepwalking Land. Few have written such hauntingly ecological portraits of war as Mozambican author Mia Couto. His first novel, Terra Sonambula, opens up with a picture of devastation and the ominous sentence, "In this place, the war had killed the road." On the road sits a burnt-out bus with charred bodies inside. The surrounding bush is littered with debris from the war. Forlorn creatures, human and non-human refugees and survivors, trudge and stumble through the war-torn, ashen landscape. Their gaze and posture turned towards the ground, since the sky had become unimaginable. Only the baobab trees stand witness to the ruination that war wreaked upon land and creatures. Only the trees are left to contemplate the world shedding its flowers. This is how Couto depicts one of the most devastating wars of the Cold War period, the post-independence war in Mozambique. Written during the war and published when the war was coming to a close, Terra Sonambula portrays a Mozambique ravaged by the long-lasting conflict while simultaneously trying to imagine a country after war, humanity after war, life after war. When I first read Couto's novel, its poetic intensity moved me. Its cast of unmoored characters in eerie landscapes intrigued me. I sensed that there was something extraordinary about the way he was telling a modern war story. The novel lingers on creatures rarely seen and heard in such narratives. From an elephant and a whale in death throes to goats and chickens in search of shelter. There's also the land, the literal and figurative ambulating land reeling from the war in an upheaval, constantly shifting, turning from marshland into savanna. Within this oniric atmosphere, the novel relates the interconnected stories of several humans displaced by the fighting, men, young and old, women and children. Yet it also shows other creatures and entities enmeshed in the armed conflict: livestock, wildlife, plants, spirits, machines, entire biomes. The novel thus reflects the profound upheaval and devastation caused by the conflict. In a country of then only 16 million people, the war cost an estimated 1 to 3 million human lives and displaced almost 6 million people, 4 million people internally, and over 1.5 million internationally. At the war's end, the Mozambican economy and infrastructure were in tatters, so much so that in the early 1990s, Mozambique had become the world's poorest and most devastated country. The war also had grave effects on the country's non-human life. In fact, the war acquired notoriety as an example of the detrimental effects of armed conflict on wildlife. And I already mentioned the devastating numbers from Gorongosa National Park. And the war also negatively affected farm animals. The number of cattle in the country was reduced by almost 2/3 due to lack of care, untreated disease, and predation, from 1,400,000 to 500,000. And in general, for Miep Kotu's work, war, humans, and the modern human world constitute a recurring theme. One of his earliest and most well-known short stories, The Day Mabata Bata Exploded, tells the fate of an ox and his young shepherd who both die because they step on landmines. Many of his novels, too, speak to the realities and remnants of war in Mozambique. Ecology, armed conflict, and human-animal conflict also play a key role in Kotu's other profession as a biologist. In 2009, Kotu even co-authored an ecological study entitled Biodiversity and War in Mozambique, which traces the aforementioned grave effects of the armed conflict on wildlife in the country. Yet I find that it is his first novel, Terra Sonambula, published 17 years prior to that study, is his prime literary articulation of the interrelation of war, humans, and the more than human world. Terra Sonambula constitutes a particularly salient and evocative representation of war as a multi-species contact zone and a depiction of armed conflict that is ecological, in the sense that it is focused on the interconnectedness of all living and non-living things. And it is not only humans and animals that are suffering under the war impact. Throughout the novel appear ghosts and spirits too, restless and disturbed by the war. The land itself is in upheaval, and human-made infrastructure and objects are hurting too. This animist multi-species framing underscores the ruinous effect of war on all things living and the spirit world. Overall, he aims to think and represent war as a multi-species tragedy. For instance, one of Terra Sonambula's most soul-stirring and mournful scenes is about a wounded, moribund elephant. The elephant appears suddenly. I'm gonna put the quote that I will be citing. He appears suddenly, a ghostly apparition in the devastated landscape. It crosses the road on which Mudinga and Tuair, two of the refugees, travel, and then disappears into the surrounding bush. The two refugees observe how the elephant stumbles across the road. The beast is dragging itself along, exhausted by its weight. The animal moves away mournfully. They notice that the elephant is bleeding from its rear and walking hesitantly, a hint of death stalking. Tuahir explains that it was probably shot for its ivory by marauding troops. The stumbling elephant, the suffering and weakness of the grand animal, presents an image of hurt and loneliness that exudes a sense of utter desolation. Once again, far away, they hear the sound of the elephant. It is like a rumbling in the far distance. Who knows? Maybe the creature has died, laid out on the vastness of the earth. The sight of the wounded elephant leaves Mudinga deeply afflicted. He feels its agony in his own heart. This is a literary rendition of what Lori Green calls entangled empathy, deep attention to the other and their well-being, and a moral perception and often embodied experience that does not separate emotion and cognition. This sorrow is also transmitted to the reader due to the dramatic lyrical brushstrokes with which Kotu paints this scene. It is a meeting within the mesh of war that operates entirely in the elegiac mode, a mourning for the elephant, for the hurting land, and all creatures swept up in the ravages of this incomprehensible war. Quote, that elephant lost in the bush is the image of the bleeding land, whole centuries lumbering deathwards across the savannah. Critics have pointed out that animals in Kotu's work tend to always have both a literal and an allegorical dimension. This is the case here too. The ailing elephant appears as a national allegory, the image of the bleeding land, but the scene also points to the very real elephants, namely the thousands of elephants that died in Mozambique because of the armed conflict. In the 2009 study Couto co-authored, the researchers explained that Renamo, Frelimo, South African and Zimbabwean forces, as well as the displaced rural civilian population, all hunted big mammals for food. Some groups also engaged in commodity hunting and animal trafficking, especially ivory, as the novel points out. The effects were particularly severe in areas where troops were stationed for longer periods of time and not just passing through. This is how Mozambique's Gorongosa National Park became the notorious and dramatic example of the negative impact of war on wildlife. Located towards the middle of the country and one of its main nature reserves, Gorongosa was disputed territory. Renamo captured the park in 1981 and used it as headquarters for a long time. Both Renamo and Frelimo laid landmines in its vicinity, and the long presence of troops led to massive declines in large mammal populations, such as elephants, wildebeests, water bucks, buffaloes, and hippopotamuses. Hippos, of which there had been 4,800 in Gorongosa in 1979, appeared near extinction in 1994. And while there had been over 3,000 elephants in the park before the war, in 1994 only 108 elephants were recorded during an aerial survey. Rhinos were extinct. The biological study from 2009 lists data, percentages, and causes, which give a sense of the proportion of the loss. Ecologists tend to focus on the ecosystem as a whole, and the fate of an individual animal is of lesser concern in the systemic view, one common point of disagreement between animal rights and environmental movements. Yet in the novel from 1992, Couto, the novelist biologist, lingers on the suffering of one individual creature. He describes a single death with a poetic poignancy that mourns and captures the elephant's creaturely life force and the tragedy of its death, which is both an individual tragedy as well as a systemic one. In Terra Sonambula, it is the brief appearance of one elephant as a material, metaphorical, creaturely being that embodies this other mass casualty of the war. It is then in fiction that Couto explores the whole range of the physical, affective, symbolic, relational, and spiritual dimension of this non-human suffering and loss, and of bearing witness to such agony and loss. Some eco-critics and post-colonial scholars might find an issue with this scene. A charge could be leveled at Couto that, with his focus on elephants, he merely repeats a cliché of white conservationists seemingly caring more about wildlife than humans, with particular and undue attention devoted to flagship species. But the novel is by no means oblivious to human suffering. In fact, it is at the center of the novel. What it does is that it places animal suffering along with human suffering, framing war as a multi-species tragedy. Couto draws attention to the pain of non-human victims of the armed conflict by practicing in his text the arts of attentiveness towards the elephant and performing a textual stretching out towards the animal. By staging this encounter at one juncture of the mesh of war, he shows human and animal suffering as intertwined. And he does not represent Black Africans as not caring about the environment, another problematic trope in some conservation narratives, but presents two Black Africans as deeply afflicted by the sight of the wounded animal. And while the novel certainly has a predilection for charismatic megafauna to signal this pain and elicit empathy in the reader, it does not mean that these are the only animals the novel features. Other creatures, big and small, beloved, ignored, or despised, such as hyenas and insects, are also part of the novel's multi-species equation. Couto also does not focus exclusively on wildlife. Domesticated animals, and particularly farm animals, goats specifically, play an important role throughout Terra Sonambula and many of his other stories and novels. He stresses repeatedly the negative impact of war on livestock. Because of their proximity to humans, the war invariably impacts farm animals. They suffer hunger and predation, also as food becomes scarce, and as fighting in the surrounding areas and displacement make sedentary agricultural practices impossible. Yet even as Koto represents war as a multi-species tragedy, there are always signs of life, of healing and rebirth, even amid the destruction and displacement. Mini ecologies of refuge that emerge within the war context. For instance, an immobilized tank gets a new life as a chicken coop. There's another refugee in the story who's surprised when he hears the sounds of dozens of hens coming from the tank's hull. And thus, a symbol of war and death has become a shelter for life, integrated into human, non-human environments. Seized by human and non-human actors, the tank has been repurposed, and thus a new wartime interdependent multi-species ecosystem is born. These are just some aspects of Miyakoto's novel. I'm going to move on to Paulina Chiziane's Ventos do Apocalipse. It's called Winds of the Apocalypse, but it's not translated into English. It is translated into other languages, Spanish, for example, but not into English. So the translation here are my own. Patrick Chabal deems Terra Sonambula undoubtedly the emblematic prose work of post-colonial Mozambique at the height of the Civil War. Yet there is another book published in close proximity, so 1993, and far less studied, that competes with it in terms of scope, ambition, poetic intensity, and biblical undertones. Ventos do Apocalipse by Paulina Chiziane, Mozambique's foremost female writer. Chiziane's novel is similar to Koto's in that she puts the emphasis on the rural area and displacement. It is also equally ambitious in its scope in that it tells the story of the war in a comprehensive, wide sweep via the suffering and the displacement of the people and their animals of one village, Mananga. The novel also shows dimensions of war as a multi-species contact zone, and animal presences are a constant. For one, the experience of displacement and refugeedom is a multi-species flight. When the people of Mananga flee at night, they flee together with their animals. In the march, the braying of the donkey, the mooing of the cow, the barking of the dog, the cackling of the chicken in the basket of who transports it, and the silence of the humans make the procession even stranger. But overall, Chiziane's representation of nature is very different from that of Koto, often negative, dangerous, dark, and laden with bad omens, channeling very much an anti-pastoral tradition. And the novel certainly offers one of the most blunt and stark descriptions of how non-humans benefit from the human carnage of war. For example, after a massacre in the village, the narrator relates that loads of flies hum satedly and get fat. In the surrounding savannah, one can hear the croaks of the vultures that are approaching. There's going to be a banquet for all the worms of Mananga. So we can see this is a very different kind of tone and aesthetic in terms of representing war as a multi-species contact zone and its ecological dimensions. One last example from Mozambique. I want to mention that literature is not the only place where the stories of war as a multi-species contact zone are told. Another space are the nature documentaries precisely about Gorongosa National Park. Which are by itself also very problematic. I can't go into that in terms of time of the talk, but I highly recommend this book, White Man's Game, that explores sort of the racial and economic dimensions of these restoration efforts. But I want to just focus briefly on this picture of elephants from Gorongosa. And if you look closely, you might notice that many of them have something missing, something essential missing, which is their tusks. And the Gorongosa herds of, as you heard, so is very few surviving elephants, and by now they're famous for their tusklessness. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this section. Um, Namely that you have an unusually high number of elephants in Gorongosa that have a genetic variation. They were born without tusks. Biologist and elephant expert Joyce Poole estimates that about 60% of adult females in the park are tuskless, contrary to the usual 2 to 3% of adult females in an unpoached herd. And now that offspring is tuskless too. It is a telling Darwinian evolution in which elephants without tusks were much more likely to survive the war and poachers and thus procreate. It directly shows the impact of the war and the ivory trade on the elephants, not only dead, but also living bodies. Yet this is not the only way that these elephants have changed through the war. They've also started to fight back against their most feared aggressor, the human. The PBS documentary and together they seek out the surviving elephants and their descendants in the park. And they point out that the elephants in the park are unusually aggressive towards humans. They charge at vehicles and are aggressive towards humans, and thus present a problem for the revival of tourism in the park. And again, the nature documentary itself is highly problematic, very colonialist in many regards, told primarily from a white perspective, and they often repeat this trope of a bygone, unspoiled wilderness in Africa. But that's sort of a little bit beyond the scope of the talk, but I just want to flag this. But what I think is remarkable about the story is that it shows elephants not only as victims, but also as non-human creatures with agencies that organize collectively to fight back against the mortal threat of humanity. If it were a novel, readers would probably find the story unbelievable and too sentimental and too cliched. But this is a story that takes place in the real. Many academics get nervous around a whiff of anthropomorphism, but it is notable how these animals have become belligerent as a response to the disruptions and suffering caused by the sustained presence and acts of troops in the region. I understand the caution against anthropomorphism, but at the same time, such intellectual caution should not make us unable to see and thus interpret the very real and troublesome acts of pachyderms in response to war. The Gorongosa elephants charge at humans and their motorized vehicles tell the story through their acts. It is a story of elephants rising as another manifestation of war as a multi-species contact zone and its afterlives. And in closing, I'm just going to mention two things. One, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about Colombia in our Q&A, but I just wanted to mention two examples from Colombia where we can also think about war as a multi-species contact zone. I've already mentioned that we have this big change and really at the vanguard of changes in law of considering nature the environment as a victim of the armed conflict as one important dimension of thinking about the armed conflict in Colombia. Another one that I wanted to mention, just that a lot of the troops, especially the guerrillas and the paramilitaries and the soldiers, a lot of the conflict took place in the rural parts of the country. And thus, in paintings that one artist, for example, later did with former combatants, what stands out that all the paintings that they did of the experience of war are green. So part of the experience was also sort of a big experience of being in nature. And in fact, in my book, I have another chapter that just talks about forests and guerrillas and how these two interact and how that impacts also the political thought of the guerrillas. And here just another example also of the remnants of the war. Again, the work by artist and photographer Juan Manuel Echevarria, who did a lot of photographs of sort of what was left behind by troops in the forested areas and what remains there from the war. That is one example to explore. And the other example that I explore also in the book is that I can explain a little bit more how it came to that in the Q&A, but just for now, that one of the strange afterlives of the armed conflict in Colombia is that by now you have a free roaming hippo population in Colombia. There's about 120 plus hippos who now live in a certain region. Hippos are African animals. They're not native to the Americas, but they're currently thriving in Colombia and have become an important symbol to reflect on the armed conflict and to think about both human and animal trauma together in the context of the war. And last but not least, in closing, I want to mention this organization. I know this is a heavy topic, which often also leaves us with wanting to do something and wanting to help. And as Manisha mentioned, the ceasefire in Gaza is precarious, to say the least. And we have a lot of human and animal suffering in the region. And this organization, Safe Haven for Donkeys, has veterinary teams that treat donkeys in Gaza. So you can donate directly to them. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for that fantastic talk. It really just took us through so many things, and you will see some of the icons. I'm not sure what to call. They're not emojis, but I'm not really sure what the terms are. But and for all the wonderful references too, and the visuals of the books and things to read, so many things to read. And so I invite all of us online to put our questions in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out for Dr. Esch. Perhaps I will just get us going here. And I can't help but think of what you're saying through my own disciplinary filter of law and all the literature that has been there for a while, but yes, accelerating, I would say, in recent years to resort to international law as South Africa for Gaza and other examples. And as we may know, even in the face of domestic legal systems and laws that seem to be ineffective, international law is even more so for a variety of reasons. And it's usually explained, well, there's no global police that does enforcement. So it's a huge problem, even at the human rights level, where there is recognition of human rights. So do you think, coming from the literature perspective and this idea that we often talk about in law is that, a change to the law must first follow a change to like the hearts and minds. Because even if you have laws in place, the enforcement is really difficult to do if you don't have the social will. So what do you think your specific geographical jurisdictional remit in the countries you're looking at and the literatures you're looking at, how do you think they would illuminate this resort to law as some type of hope for animals in terms of, at least at one level, greater visibility in the laws of war, for example, in getting the Geneva Conventions to apply to animals as civilians, right, or as prisoners. And the flip side of that, coming out of the law context, the memorial context, we know that we have certain war memorials as exhibitions and displays in London or Australia or what have you. And how do you see that type of new development of public recognition of the role of animals in war as relating to the hope that I perceive in the work for us to understand not just animals as being used in war or the traumas they're suffering, but to think of all of that as well as the remaking of nature and life worlds that is going on. So very open-ended, large questions, but invite your comments on that, and then I will be very happy to read out the next question we have in the line.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an excellent question, a complicated one. I'm thinking sort of really thinking from the art and from the literature and thinking about that as a form of philosophy. I do think thinking with Miyakoto, and something I didn't talk that much about in the talk, is I think his novel is very much a novel of nation building, right? So it's about post-national nation building after war. Um, but the nation building that he envisions is where animals and the land and its creatures are part of the conception of the nation. So if we think of that concept of Benedict Anderson as nation as an imagined community, his imagined community includes the land, includes the animals. And if that were kind of, and I find that actually quite radical, and I think relatively challenging to Western conceptions of thinking about the nation. And I feel if that actually be sort of turns into law conceptions, I do think that makes a big difference of how we think about what do we mean when we talk about a nation. And I'm interested by that because usually I'm skeptical towards a lot of nationalist proposals, which I do feel with some of the kind of memorials for animals, they seem to linger on that nationalist conception that actually maybe doesn't question the nation state on a broader scale, but just sort of as they're also soldiers, also victims of the war. So um, that's one thought that I have. And then um, thinking about Colombia specifically, I feel that is sort of, in terms of law, really the most interesting case. And I would say that Latin America, in many ways, is at the vanguard of rights of nature. And you have rights of nature installed in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. And then Colombia, this recognition of the territory, which is also a different conception of nature. I say nature and environment, but territory is really sort of a cultural, biological term which talks about the assemblages between different people and other entities. Um, and I do think that changes there. I think the law changed, and it also led to an explosion of culture production around that. So I kind of feel they nourish each other, that it's not that one is first, that first the literature and arts works on that, and then the law happens, but that they kind of influence each other. And I do think that is changing the thinking about those legislations in a broader term. I do think I have heard people in Colombia critique the notion of territories or nature as victims because of the question of that it doesn't take into account agency. Because if you're a victim, the river as a victim, then it's sort of passive, and it doesn't take into account the own agency of the river or of an ecosystem. So there's definitely also debate about that.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So, our first question comment here is from Fernando. Thank you, Fernando, who writes, I understand the focus of your research is on how war affects non-humans, either as victims or non-willing participants. But is the way we treat animals not a cause for the conflict itself? In Colombia, the most violent actor in the war by a far margin was the paramilitary group AUC, Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, which was mainly funded by cattle ranchers to defend their interests. In just 9 years of existence, they were responsible for the death of over 200,000 people. Are we not compartmentalizing when we leave farm animals out of this discussion? By being seen as mere resources worth killing for, are they not also victims of the war? Are we not implying that certain non-human lives are worth more than others, i.e., wild versus livestock?
Thank you so much, Fernando, for that question. And I think those are also several questions I've thought about, and in various contexts. I do think that for this talk, and specifically, I focused on wildlife, but I'm always very aware that sort of there is this tendency, especially also because writers and artists tend to focus a lot on charismatic megafauna, that you fall into that trap of only focusing on that. So I'm very aware of that. In the book overall, I do talk about livestock a lot, and I have, for example, an entire chapter dedicated to urban pig husbandry in the context of the Angolan and Cuban revolutions and the war in Angola, and precisely how the question of liberation in the context of post-colonial and decolonial liberation intersects with the question of animal liberation and certain conflicts and contrasts that come to mind there. Um, and and in terms of farm animals, I don't, I mean, I don't see my work as compartmentalizing it, but just sort of saying I'm focusing on one specific aspect, which is armed conflict, which is conscious of that there's different forms of exploitation and oppression of animals. And I always say in the book, every time I mention these numbers, for example, the numbers that I mentioned from Mozambique about the elephants or the hippos, they of course pale in comparison by the numbers of animals killed yearly in the meat industry across the world. There is no comparison, but as we I think also learned in the conflict, in recent conflicts, it's it's hard to make these comparisons. So I'm trying to avoid that comparison in order to be able to talk on one specific side of the exploitation, suffering, but also agency of animals. But thank you for the questions. Very important questions.
Thank you. So Martina, thank you, Martina, for your question. Says, thanks a lot for a very interesting presentation. My PhD research focuses on human-animal relations in military contexts in Sweden and Finland between 1917 and 1970. I've been thinking a lot about the concept of animal agency, which I've so far mostly encountered as being equated with animal resistance in empirical studies. In your view, what other ways are there to study animal agency?
That is an excellent question. I think about of sort of to not reduce animal agency to just the act of resistance of animals, which seem to be maybe for us the most visible and easy to see. If I go just based on my literature, I think there's a lot of agency in acts that are not necessarily related with resistance per se, but with making contact, aka the animal gaze. There's sort of a lot of work has been done. There's also a book dedicated on the animal gaze in South African literatures, for example. I'm thinking also about like moments of recognition that happen and how often in literature we describe this moment of encounter when the eyes meet, and somehow that can be transformative for the human. Um, so I think agency broadly in terms of acts of movements, gazes, sounds, all of which can have an impact. And I think other forms of agency, if I think of the example of the mosquitoes that I mentioned, um, it's not agency in a sense of an intentional act that, as far as we know, mosquitoes decided to aid the Haitian independence fighters, but the transmission of yellow fever and different forms of immunity amongst different groups, different troops, foreign and not foreign, had a huge impact on the outcome of the war because the troops of Napoleon the Third were decimated by yellow fever. So I think that's another form of agency that doesn't have the part of intentionality in it, but it does impact human history uh, quite severely and quite broadly. And that's why I think paying attention to insects is sort of the other dimension. So we have the question of wildlife and maybe also megafauna, the question of livestock, or farm animals, companion animals, and then insects, and the question of zoonosis as really a key factor of the experience of war. So also in my guerrilla narratives, you can read the Diario of Che Guevara in Bolivia, and the first creatures they encounter in Bolivia are insects. And 2 months later, and like he talks about it, they don't have enough mosquito nets, etc. And 2 months later, half the troop has malaria, and others have fly larvae in their bodies. So it affects the troop from early on. So that would be another form of agency in my mind.
Thank you, Dr. Esch. I would just briefly mention I encountered an article, again in the legal sphere, in the Cornell Law Review about animals and moral agency. As we may know, a common retort by judges in the test case litigation occurring in the United States about, animals should have rights is that, well, they can't hold duties, and that goes down to them not being seen as moral agents, just moral patients, and all the philosophy that kind of leaves this binary intact. And so this argument is like a feminist approach to thinking about agency by Tammy Bryant in the Cornell Law Review, talking about without intentionality, we can think of moral agency. Okay, so we have, yes, about 10 minutes left, and we're happy to go through our questions. Alexa sends a comment just about the philanthropy initiatives that Sulala Animal Rescue is an excellent organization to support. They're the only animal rescue organization operating in Gaza with respect. Safe haven for donkeys is Israeli. Thank you, Alexa, for that insight. We next have Yuan, who says, thank you so much, Dr. Esch, for this enlightened talk. 2 questions. 1, are there known sources from the past, before 20th century, of any tradition, either in history or literature, where animal and tree destruction in wars were recorded? And 2, similar to what I believe is currently lacking in our account of catastrophes caused by climate events, is it conceivable that in the near future we would always meticulously account for animal and plant and environmental destruction among the costs of wars? What would it take for us to get to that?
Okay. 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 Known source from past animal and tree destruction. I mean, the 2 things that come to mind is the literature on the Vietnam War and Agent Orange in terms of tree destruction. So I had I think on the slide, Toxic War is one of the ones. So I would definitely look into that. And I believe there's some works that focus on terrain and changes to terrain during the American Civil War also. Those but I would always think, I mean, sort of also with the lit review that I did, sort of there's always the case study of a specific war, of a specific context, but sort of no broad overview. In the case of Mozambique, for example, I know also that trees were raised at the side of the road, for example, to avoid ambushes. So trees next to roads were often cut. Um, mm, I mean, and to the second question, I mean, I think that is my hope. I think just as with the question on legal changes, I feel with all of that, we're very much at the beginning of a discussion because I think it's very hard for humans to think about all the dimensions of thinking truly ecologically and thinking what would it mean to account for um, animal deaths or tree deaths and how to count them, how to account for insects, for example. I think it's very challenging, but I think that's certainly the hope.
Thank you. And we have our next question from Svetlana. Thank you, Svetlana, who says, speaking about the impact of war on non-humans, it is worth paying attention to the current war in Ukraine. There are already numerous studies examining the environmental consequences of the war, its devastating ecocidal effects. For instance, Daria Cymbaluk's book, Ecocide in Ukraine, focuses on this topic. At the same time, one can also speak about the renewal of nature, such as the gradual recovery of the Kakhovka Reservoir ecosystem showing how nature begins to heal itself. So this might be more of a comment, but if you had anything you wanted to add, Dr. Esch.
No, I appreciate the comments. I think this is also in part kind of collecting precisely the works done in very different areas and connecting them at a global scale. And hopefully this conversation will help for that. And I do feel that is precisely also why it is so tricky to think through this aspect of war as a multi-species context zone, that you have these two dimensions of rewilding and of ecocide that can happen at the same time in the same region. Maybe one region is rewilding while the other is suffering ecocidal warfare. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Our next question, fascinating from Narda. Thank you, Narda. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. Your discussion of the arts of attentiveness and witnessing reminded me of Deborah Bird Rose's work on dingo and flying fox persecution. I'm wondering if you came across examples in the literature of creatures being enlisted as agents of war or agents of resistance. Thinking, for example, of the way hedges were enlisted in England to privatize the commons, grazing and agricultural commons. Semi-related also reminded me of the destruction of olive trees in Gaza as a deliberate tactic of cultural genocide war.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a great question, to be honest. In specifically in the literature that I'm analyzing, it's generally not a topic, or the enlisting of animals. The only thing that I can think of in terms of persecution of specific animals is just a topic that I touched upon very briefly at the end, is the hippos that are considered a so-called invasive species in Colombia, and there's a lot of public debates in terms of what to do with them. And in 2009, the Colombian state started culling the hippos, and there were widespread protests, and it stopped there. And it's sort of still very much debated what to do with them. So, but specific enlisting of them, I cannot think of in the literature, which always the literature will choose specific things which will not necessarily translate into what's happening in reality. There's one novel from Kenya called Seasons in Hippoland, where there are hippos that are kind of become a symbol of liberation and a resistance that continues to live on in the context of authoritarianism, and that are connected to liberation fights from the 1970s. But they're very symbolic hippos, let's put it that way. You know, like very metaphorical. They're not very explicit in their hipponess.
So we have two final comments. I'll just read them together in our closing moments for response here. First is from David. Thank you, David, who says, does broadening the definition of war into environmental concerns become a factor in the prevention of war? And an interesting comment about yellow fever and Napoleonic Wars, and also about increasingly aggressive behaviors of elephants in Angola. Nature fights back. Will there become a tipping point wherein the potential for adverse environmental impacts makes wars less likely? And Andrea writes, thank you, Andrea, for your question. Thank you for this discussion of such an interesting topic. I noticed your mention of being careful about not anthropomorphizing animals. I'm in my late 50s and grew up studying the sciences in a time when only humans were considered to have intellect, emotion, or reflection, and animals acted only by instinct. And any idea that suggested otherwise was dismissed by academia as anthropomorphizing. I have been encouraged and fascinated by the growing body of scientific literature that demonstrates, unsurprisingly, that animals share, quote unquote, our traits, including studies that demonstrate what appears to be PTSD in elephant populations. Do you feel that you have faced much pushback in academia or from the public when you propose ideas about animal agency, emotion, etc.?
Thank you so much for these excellent questions and the discussion in general. To David's question, a book I highly recommend, it might have been on my first slide, is The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism. It's a book that actually traces how also the birth itself of environmentalism is can be related to the Cold War and militaries thinking about about employing nature to for global warfare. And so this as the military thinks about creating these weapons, sort of also this increasing concern about wiping out humanity, wiping out the planet becomes part of the discourse. And I think it's really interesting to think about these connections because as a scholar of war, I always feel that war is in many ways one of the underlying structures of our system. So it's actually also related itself to the birth of environmentalism and thinking on a planetary scale. And um, um, and one would hope that this will lead to thinking about prevention of wars, but that's also, I think, brings us back to the discussion of the atomic bomb and whether that the existence of the atomic bomb really is a preventive tool or it should not have been created ever in the first place. Um, and the question of anthropomorphism, Andrea, I have so far not received any pushback, but I think I'm basing myself in the discussion based on that there is so much academic discomfort when it comes to anthropomorphism. But I do feel, especially literary scholars, are pushing back a lot against that. And I think it's really important. I feel literary scholars for too long adopted the fear of anthropomorphism from the sciences, where it was such a big taboo. But but I work with literature. Ultimately, this is a human art form that thinks from a human perspective, and anthropomorphism is also one of the way of how we think about animals, how we can imagine, interpret these acts. And I think it's actually a very powerful tool that we have at hand for empathy and for thinking about otherness, which animals are. There is then to in part they're not accessible to us. So anthropomorphism helps us think about animals within human, more than human categories. So
Dr. Esch, I cannot thank you enough for such a fascinating talk, illuminating talk on so many levels and of reaches of the world that we often are not paying attention to. We really appreciate the time and wisdom you shared with us today. And I'd also like to mention our co-sponsor at the University of Victoria, the Center for Global Studies as well, for being our partner for today's talk. Thank you to all of you who joined us again for so many time zones. It was just simply wonderful to have you here. I would like to bring your attention to our next event online, which will be on February 13th in the new year. We're looking forward to the 5th annual lecture in animal rights, law, and policy here at the University of Victoria, which will be delivered by Professor Matilda Arvidsson from Sweden, Associate Professor at Law, previously at Gothenburg, now at Lund University, and she will be presenting under the title More Than Human and Non-Human Relations in Law, a Jurisprudence of Gardens. If you're here in Victoria, please join us in person, and it will also be a hybrid to join us online. Again, Holly has posted our details. If you'd like to stay abreast of and be on our newsletter, please join us. And please join me now in thanking Dr. Esch for a wonderful talk. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again at our future events.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.